Hello, my name is Diane Buglioli, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director at A Very Special Place Incorporated, which is an agency that provides services here on Staten Island to individuals with developmental disabilities. But today, actually, I'm wearing my hat as the co-chairperson of the Willowbrook Legacy Committee, which is a committee of the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council, which is the primary advocacy group for people with disabilities and their families here on Staten Island. This show has been sponsored by that council as well as CTV. The show, Willowbrook Revisited, is a retrospective look back at Willowbrook State School, the property it was on, the people who lived there, the people who worked there, the events that happened there, and the changes in society that were caused actually by Willowbrook's existence. You know, there were three main exposés that were done about Willowbrook. One was done in the New York Times, and it was a very sparse one. It was a couple of articles in 1965 when Bobby Kennedy visited Willowbrook, and he called it a snake pit. In 1971, there was a more sustained expose, and that was done right here on Staten Island by Jane Kurtin and the Staten Island Advance. And the third was done by Geraldo Rivera with ABC Eyewitness News. I feel so honored and excited today to have with us Jane Kurtin and Brian Laline from the Advance. You know, in the past on Willowbrook Revisited, we've done around 8 shows. This is the 9th show. And other people that have been here have been the activists that were involved in the closing of Willowbrook, and some people who had a historical perspective. They wrote about Willowbrook from that perspective. So they were writing about it today, about what happened then. But today, by having Brian and Jane here, who is now Dr. Jane because she received an honorary degree at the College of Staten Island for her work, they are coming from an investigatory journalistic perspective of documenting things as it was happening. So this is a whole new side to the show, and I'm very, very pleased for them to be here. You know, the three of us got onto this story or this journey that we've taken knowing Willowbrook a couple of years apart. I started at Willowbrook State School as a recreation worker in 1969. You wrote your first article, 1971, and Brian came to the Advance in 1972. So it's a long reach back to shake our memories. I sometimes say that, you know, we're like dinosaurs, but we are dinosaurs that speak. So we get to help people to put historical context into place, and for us then to hopefully learn and remember the past to protect our futures. So I'm so pleased to have the two of you here today. I wanted to start with some questions that I think people, as I've met people and talked to people and was talking about that we were going to have this opportunity for the show, they had questions. I must have received around 15 questions from different people when they knew that the two of you were going to be on the show. But I thought the best way might be to start just to look at some of the articles that were in place. And maybe we talk just a few minutes about each one. You know, Brian and I, to try and retrieve the articles, we went down to the dusty archives of the Staten Island Advance, hoping for it to be digitized soon, right, Brian?
Yeah, we hope so.
Yeah. Because I think from 1991 forward, it's digitized.
That's right.
And so we were down there in the actual newspapers, looking through them for the articles.
It's really very, very troubling to me because something that you said is you cannot forget the past.
Yeah.
And it's so easy today to forget the past unless you have a record of it.
Absolutely.
And that is why it's so critical to have these things digitized, because that's the world in now which we live.
Absolutely. So let's start. The first article that came out was, ironically, it was November 15th, 1971. Today's the 13th of November.
Oh my gosh.
So that's how long ago it was, right? And the first article was Parents Protest Cutbacks at State School. And I mean, that's what was happening. The budgets were being cut. This sort of goes in line with my first question. Why did this article, how did this article get written? Why did the Advance look this way? Willowbrook's been there since the late 40s, early 50s. What was it, the times? Was it that things were changing in our country, the late 60s, all of the revolutionary thoughts and people asking why certain things a certain way and we need to change them? Was it a group of parents came to the Advance, or, you know?
Well, I can tell you, my recollection of it
Yeah.
is that I had, prior to any information or really any knowledge of Willowbrook, I had done some stories about a strike at the Public Health Service Hospital, and it was a CSEA, I think the Civil Service Employees Association strike.
Right.
And two of the doctors that were involved in that at that time, as I recall, Mike Wilkins for sure, and I think Bill Bronston was also there. And they found a sympathetic perspective from me. They appreciated my take on what I wrote, how I represented their problems at Public Health Service Hospital.
Right.
They eventually were at Willowbrook, and before these protests happened, they contacted me and told me that something interesting was going to be happening, and asked me if I would come there and cover it. And
When did you start working at the Advance?
maybe a year or two before that.
So
Probably.
how old were you? You were in your 20s, no?
I was like 21.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, my God.
exactly. Oh my God.
Well, this is a very complex story, and it involved so much, political pulls, things happening. Everybody was finger pointing, whose problem was it? And as I read the series of articles, it was so good. I mean, I keep saying it to you, and you're very modest, but you really stayed. You were such a good investigative reporter. You gave the facts, and you didn't have any pull in any certain direction, except for the pull of being humanistic, which is not a non-factual thing. It's just,
Yeah, well, I will tell you that I don't think I've read any of these articles, in 45 years for sure. I mean, they were a part of ancient history to me. And I had the opportunity to refresh my memory by going over them now. And as an adult, as a grandmother, as an older woman, I read it, and they got me. The articles got me emotionally. I was, very happy that I wasn't embarrassed by what I had written. I was afraid to go back and look and think about it. But I was also moved and shocked by what I read, as though I was kind of reading it for the first time. And the unbelievable lack of humanity from the perspective of today was just staggering.
That's what, I was not working at the Advance when Jane did these stories, and she had left the company by the time I started. And I've struggled all these years to try to figure out why nothing happened between Kennedy's visit in '65 and when you took on this story in the early '70s, '71, I guess it was. And I haven't come up with an answer. I can suspect, in the New York Times, for example, a reporter gets 6 months to work on a story. At a local newspaper like ours, a reporter gets about 6 minutes. So maybe between '65 and '71, people were distracted. I don't know. But when you think about it, when it was highlighted in '65, and this is no disrespect to anybody who came before me, but between '65 and '71, the horrors that were occurring, that frankly we just a miracle had happened, but we certainly let happen in our own backyard. So as much as believe me, I think the Staten Island Advance does incredible work over this 100 and something years. But that is one period in our history which I think I'm so pleased that Jane has stepped forward again. Because for so many years, Jane stayed in the background. And, we can finally tell the story about what a local newspaper did. And we can talk about Geraldo later. But it was the local newspaper who made this happen after Kennedy. And I don't care what anybody says. It was this woman who made it happen.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I just want to say that the Staten Island Advance was a place where, when I was there back in the day, the community called and you answered the phone.
That's right.
In the newsroom. You actually spoke to people. There was a real connection to the people.
Oh.
And the Advance was a paper that, that was small enough to be local and intimate and too big to be provincial. And part of that was, Richard Diamond and the risk-taking kind of perspective that he took on things and the support that he gave for a go-get-'em kind of thing. It brought it to a personal level for people.
I can relate to that. I think of my dad. My dad worked for the World Telegram and Sun. He was a tabulator, and he would read the World Telegram Sun as he traveled back on the ferry. But when he got home and we finished dinner, he would take his paper and he'd walk in the thing and he'd read the paper cover to cover. And he would find in it, my mother would make circles, because she would read it cover to cover in the daytime. If there was any typos, my mother would circle them, and she would call the Advance. And if my father had a question, he would call the Advance. And that was, I think it's why it had so much impact on the island, because islanders trusted the newspaper. They trusted what they read. When the second article, which was probably the most, hitting, I think, of all of them, was Willowbrook Inside the Cages. And when people read your article, they believed that that's what was happening there. They didn't doubt it. And I think for that time period, I think our society was changing, and I think people were involved in the turmoil of the Vietnam War and things that were happening. And when you rode the 117 bus through Willowbrook, all you saw was this pastoral grounds.
That's right.
But they couldn't know what was going on inside. And that's what you brought to people. You said, this is what's going on inside.
Right, and I will just say that the benefit of being that young and being that clueless about, really kind of clueless about the inefficiency and the cruelty of bureaucracy, made it that personal and that shocking, that it was incomprehensible to me, and I think part of that was, conveyed in the tone of the article. It was incomprehensible that A, it was happening, and B, that there was nothing to make it stop happening.
Yeah.
And if you talk about what happened, why, I don't know why nothing happened between 65 and 71. I think part of it is that Staten Island, we did feel that this was happening to our kids. This was in our backyard. It brought a kind of a passion to it.
In your article, you wrote our children. Yeah.
So there was a passion to it, but the distance that government had, the actual physical distance, gave them an emotional distance from this.
Yeah.
And when I read about it again, and I saw that local politicians, I was remembering, you mean they weren't there for years?
I know.
They didn't go there for years at a time? They were surprised by it? And all of that distance allows a dehumanization of the relationship to the population. So it wasn't like they were actually doing something to people. It was like they were not doing something about something that they knew nothing about, couldn't understand, and didn't want to know about. It's too big.
Yeah, and it's true as well. The next article was about more Willowbrook cuts feared, and they've been being cut, routinely. And your perception at the time, and as you say today, there was a distance, and people were just cutting. I remember it was Assemblyman Russo in one of the articles says, well, I have to face, taxpayers don't want to pay more money. And you want to say, but you have people who are dying because of neglect, at some point, if you really told the taxpayers what were happening, I'm sure people would say, we need to take care of this. This is the great state of New York, after all, which I do believe in, by the way.
Right.
And so we need to step up to the plate on this. But it was, at first, it was like people were going like this, well, we have cuts coming. And there had to be the cry, which you start to really, you start to talk about it now in this next article, is Willowbrook blames Albany. We start to have this happening between the Board of Visitors and the Assembly people, who didn't go there for 6 years, some of them.
Correct.
Yeah.
And the unbelievable, when you say finger pointing, that they can't get the money, so they can't meet the requirements, so they can't get the money, so they won't get the federal money, so the whole, and it was like, what? How could that, how do you unravel that?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it was, and the distance that they kept from it made it impossible for them to unravel it, so.
Right. The next article continues to talk about that, because you really, and these articles, people, you're able to get this at the archives at the College of Staten Island. And you could sit down and read all of the articles, including the editorials that were being written at the same time. And because the Staten Island Advance was clearly behind that there needed to be changes, and there were many op-eds written. But here it says the board visits Willowbrook 2 hours a month. But when you go into the article and you read it more, and you realize some didn't do that either.
Right.
Right, so that's how that distancing is happening. They're not seeing it as people. And you come across that, something that we're facing today is that moral decisions are being made based on a ledger sheet, and not really what the impact is to those human beings that we have responsibility towards, you know. The next one is interesting. The state orders a probe for Willowbrook. That's your next article.
Yeah.
And you were young, but you were so perceptive in the things. The probe was ordered, and then two of the assembly people are arguing, Russo and a man. One is saying, no, they're not arguing. The person from Brooklyn, I can't remember, it was an assemblyman from Brooklyn who said it needs to be an independent audit. It can't be an audit. The Department of Mental Hygiene can't audit itself. And so, you know, you could report it. You give them that information. You didn't point fingers and say, you know, you're doing this wrong. Of course you can't. It has to be independent. You just said, here's the information. Listen to this insanity. So now Russo and a man are kind of struggling on the island, and then this Brooklyn assemblyman comes into it and says, it needs to be an independent probe, the end. And to my reading, the probe never happened. Right, the task force was never set up.
As far as I recall, there was no task force,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, he was asking that there be a task force set up separately, right, out of Rockefeller's, office, and instead of the Department of Mental Hygiene doing an audit of itself, basically, right?
Yeah.
The next article is something you referred to. State school can't meet the state standards.
Correct.
So they were in jeopardy of losing more money because they weren't meeting the standards, which would mean they would be defunded.
Right, but it made such a confusing situation, because part of what they, and when I look back, I have a certain sympathy for instance, Jack Hammond, for the administrator who cannot believe that he was 56 when he died. I thought he was an old man.
So did I. So did I.
But they were in a position of having to protect the illusion that things were okay, because if they weren't okay, they were going to get worse. And money was going to be withheld. So when they didn't want, I'm not defending it, but they didn't want too close a look that was going to put them in worse situation that they thought that they were in already. It was a horror. It was an absolute horror, especially in a situation where the kind of care, I mean, it's dramatic to talk about, lives lost, and I put in there in the articles some of the really nightmarish things. But with that population, the time spent to spend enough time to educate and to toilet train, simply to toilet train, not reading, toilet train. Toilet training meant the difference between being able to go home with your family as an adult, as a young adult, not a baby, or not go home. That was a real clear problem. So when you had budgets that didn't give you enough staff to deal with the most primitive form of training, the whole system just stayed frozen where it was, and the nightmare was just continued.
I think the number in there was that 61% of the people who lived at Willowbrook at the time were not toilet trained.
Right.
And I worked in the baby unit and for a number of years, and I remember a little guy that I used to take home. His name was Josh, and he wasn't toilet trained until he was 7 or 8, and he learned to walk around the same time, not because of any inability on his part, but because there was no one there to teach him to do those things.
No one to teach, right?
He took his first steps towards me, and which is when people say, well, how could you stay in that setting? I say, I stayed in that setting because I got to witness those things. I got to see some of the progress that people made, and it was my job, as I saw it, to bring the outside in, and if I left, then who was going to do that? I trusted myself, and I cared, and I knew there were many other staff that cared, but the number was so small in terms of the amount of staff. So it wasn't, as you said, it wasn't that they were ineducable, which was a term from those days, or non-trainable. It was that there was no one there to do that type of training with them or educational services with them. It was very, very low in number. Willowbrook Probe when? This is you following up. Boom, 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 boom. November and December, you were just hitting them every single day. Then in the Sunday paper as well. You know, people could not look away from it. It was there. You know, it was a sustained effort on the part, your part, and as well as the Advance in supporting it. So, to my knowledge and your recollection as well, the probe never happened.
To my knowledge, the probe never happened.
And you kept pushing this whole thing until 1972, when that's when the, and here's one in terms of, now all of this is going on, and now the federal funds were being, because of the Medicaid dollar that was going in, and they weren't meeting those standards either, so they're going to lose state funding and they're going to lose federal funding. There'd be no funding, and then what would they do?
And then what would they do?
And then what would they do? So, you touched on a few things that I'd like to go back on. One of my questions was, and other people had as well, was, what was the feeling in the Advance? Now, you came in 72, so you're still in the midst of some of this. What was the feeling of you? You say what your feeling was, right? And it was probably, you were focused on the articles and you were young, so some of it didn't impact upon you until you read it later. And you're reflecting on it, right?
Correct.
What was the feeling in the Advance about it? Was it just that excitement of an investigative piece? Was there sadness? Was there disgust on the part of people, or frustration? Was there a sense in the newsroom in terms of when you were doing this? Because you were the main writer for this, but I saw as I read all the articles, there were a couple of other reporters that did isolated pieces. You were hard hitting, and you followed through.
Well, it was my story at that moment,
right? Yeah.
We're all human beings.
Yeah.
There at that time, and I think it's hard to separate what was the driving force. Certainly, that it was an important story was obvious, but. It was obvious, but it wasn't the drive for it. It took a few days before it started to feel like, wow, something is happening. There's a response to this.
Yeah.
And then, at the paper, it's a responsibility, and it's a good story.
Yeah.
And it's a tragedy. It was all of those things. The paper, with the newsroom. The editors, everybody was encouraging and supportive, and it was a good place and a good time with a lot of help and a lot of and a lot of encouragement.
Yeah, my take on Richard Diamond was that he was a person who was passionate about the island, and about its citizens, and he cared about what was happening. So I imagine he was very supportive in this.
Absolutely. Passionate, unconflicted, encouraging, a risk taker. I mean, having me do this was taking a risk. I was a kid. Really, I was. It was happened. He didn't take it away from me. He encouraged me to do it. He was a terrific guy, a terrific, supportive, concerned, smart, energetic guy.
Yeah.
Well, Dick Diamond is all of those things. He was the publisher of the paper. And without Dick's support,
Right.
You really couldn't do what Jane did. But I also have to credit Les Troutman.
Les Troutman, for sure.
Les Troutman was the editor of the paper.
Les
And
Troutman.
people misunderstood Dick and Les a lot on Staten Island because he seemed like a very stern guy, but he was a very shy guy,
Yeah.
but strong and smart. And, I worked with Dick longer than I knew my own father. And I learned a lot from him, but I also learned a lot from Les.
Mm-hmm.
Les was a tough newspaper editor, but had a gentle side in terms of wanting to help everybody in the community. And that goes from the nonprofit charities to the people. So they both taught me a lot. So as I said, I came in after Jane, and I watched the Willowbrook consent decree, but I also watched a lot of other things on Staten Island, which to this day distress me because I still see a lot of it in terms of intolerance.
Not in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And I wonder, what I wonder is, as you were writing this story, is, the politicians react. And I've got about 1,000 philosophies of journalism, and one of them is, the politicians know, keep your head down long enough, they'll go away. Well, you didn't go away. And that's what you got to do. You got to keep on hammering them until they finally say, okay, she's not going away.
Yeah.
But how did the community react? Did you feel community support for this? Because, when I picked up reporting after you left, the community was very, very against homes for the developmentally disabled, for example. Terry Troyer, the local homeless advocate on Staten Island, her car was rocked. Not long after you left, there was a black family that wanted to move on to Milton Avenue in Newdorp, the Alberto Charles family. Mm-hmm. Well, the Saturday morning of the weekend they were to move in, their house was burned down.
Mm-hmm. I remember that.
So this is what Staten Island was in those
Yeah,
days. Yeah. And sadly, I wrote a column last week that I admit I do live in a glass half empty life. But I see still a lot of it today. So my question is, did you feel community support as well?
I don't remember. I don't remember a feeling of community support. I don't remember a lack of that part of it is gone into the.
I think you were young though too.
I was so young. I remember feeling when I spoke to local politicians, and I remember feeling that I was just a real pest. Mm. And that I found a tremendous satisfaction, I have to say later, that in those moments where the impulse of these older guys was to be dismissive, that it at a certain point changed. And that was the power of writing something that got attention and
well, it was catalytic to a change that was coming.
There was a change. So I clearly was writing about something that a lot of people were reading, and they had to pay attention. And when you read the articles and you see that suddenly they're trying to describe how they were going, and it was like kind of lining up to be the first one to say, "Oh yeah, it was awful. I was there." And I saw it, and it was awful. It was pretty funny.
Yeah, I remember that article as well, and there was an article that followed up that Edward Ammon, I guess it's pronounced, said Willowbrook is depressing, and I thought, oh my goodness, boy, what an understatement that is.
Wasn't that something?
Yeah, that was one of the headlines, and but I remember the article you're talking about where. I have to go to a hearing, Ways and Means meeting. So out of the 10 people that could have gone,
Yeah.
I think 2 went, or
Right.
3 went.
And very seldom.
Well,
And
Jane, just to frame the kind of person Jane is, I'll never forget this line. When she was receiving her honorary doctorate, she said, I'm no person who pulls up and moves the orange cone. And that's what she did on Staten Island. She had the nerve to step up and do it.
yeah,
But after Jane left, and I think another person I really need to credit on Staten Island for keeping the sensitivity alive was Betty Conley.
yeah, I was just
Oh,
about to
yeah.
go there.
I mean,
1973 to
oh
2000
my
something.
God, she was just unbelievable in advocating for everybody who needed help, whether it be the third grader in some public school in Stapleton that was reading that their school books were literally 40 years old,
Yeah.
to the Willowbrook situation.
She was the consummate
unbelievable.
elected official. I
And
never
her husband,
called
Bob,
Bob Conley.
with her,
He's the
with her
best.
every step of the way.
That if I was I recently I did a presentation and I talked about my relationship with Betty Conley. She was just a mentor of mine. She just is such an honorable woman. And when I was the chairperson at council back in '86 or so, and we had this issue, and I went to see Betty in her office, and of course she put her office right at Willowbrook, so people would have to come on the grounds to see her. And she didn't agree with me, and I said, and I kept on repeating it to her as if she was hard of hearing. I kept on saying, "No, Betty, you don't understand. If we do it this way, then this will happen." And she said, "No, Diane, it's not going to happen." I said, "No, Betty," and I keep repeating it. And finally, she said, "Diane, I can hear fine. I'm disagreeing with you. We can't do it this way. We're going to have to find another way." And I was furious, and I said, "Fine, Mrs. Connolly." I never called her. "Fine, Mrs. Connolly." I left the office. I didn't talk to her for around 3 months. And I'd see her at different events. And Bob would always wave to me. He knew I wasn't talking to Betty, but he waved to me. And finally, I walked up to her. We were at the Staten, and I walked up, and I said, she said, "You're talking to me now?" So I said, "Yes." She said, "Diane, you got to learn there are crucial battles, and those are the ones that you fight.
Yeah.
There are others, they're not crucial, and you got to learn to let them go, But she actually made me cry. I went to my car that day, and I cried because I couldn't believe I was on the opposite side of her. What an honorable woman. She
Well,
tremendous
the
effect on
delegation
the
in
island.
those days was, I mean, I think Staten Island's been very fortunate over at least the course of my career, to have very good political representation. But, as with any politician, they react to the community.
Yeah,
But no, I mean, you had people like Eric Vitaliano, who's now a federal judge. I mean,
Yeah.
Eric was the most principled human being I think I've ever
Yeah.
met in my lifetime.
yeah.
But when you had the combination of Betty and Eric and then John Markey, my God, what a delegation.
Yeah. John Markey was the only one, and I think did I read it in your articles? He was the only one that voted for the tax increases, because he knew it was the only way to get more funding into the thing. And the other people voted against them, which would meant that they would continue with the cuts. So John Markey, did do his due diligence on what needed to be addressed, and some of it was purely funding.
Right.
It was purely funding.
Yeah.
To me, the press is so important to our liberties in a way, right? It's one of our main liberties, freedom of speech. And it has a responsibility for the maintenance of those rights. And I'm wondering what you're thinking in this declining era of press journalism, where there's this tremendous emphasis on the internet and on those quick type of responses that you get on the internet, the tweets, rather than somebody sitting reading an article, processing the information, and then proceeding with some type of sustained social response. That's something that journalism is going through now. What's your impression on it?
Well, I've seen it from the days of hot lead to today. And I am very distressed as to what's happening. I don't even know where to begin with it. Revenue-wise, journalism is in trouble. In my heyday as an editor of a newspaper, and I'm not talking a long time ago, I've worked at the Advance in '72, but I've been editor since '92. So sometime between '92 and now, I had 152 people on the newsroom staff. I now have 35. Now, some of that is because of efficiencies, and we consolidated some people in New Jersey, and they were layout people, but the basic reporting staff has been slashed by 70% probably. And it's impossible to cover a community of 500,000 people with that number of people. And I think the attitude of journalists have changed some as well because of the way people react and what they react to. And again, I admitted I live in a glass half empty life, and I'm trying to look at the other way. But people react to entertainment today.
Yeah.
So instead of worrying about the arts on let's take Willowbrook out of it. Instead of worrying about the local arts or Snug Harbor, or they worry about the housewives of Orange County or the Jersey Shore. So that when we today with the internet, with SI Live or with any online publication, you know who's reading, when they're reading, how long they're reading, how many times they click. If we put up a story about Snug Harbor, you get a handful of clicks. This is absolute fact. You put up a story when the Jersey Shore was hot about that. We had a reporter covering the Jersey Shore alone. The response was enormous.
Yeah.
And you see it today. It's all about the headline. It's all about, sometimes the number, I don't know if I should admit this, but sometimes the number one story on our site is Ask Amy, which is the advice column.
I know.
Because the headline is enticing, it's titillating, it's sexy, whatever it is. So it takes a lot to excite the community about an important local story. And I'll just wrap it up by saying, I think the internet it's incredibly valuable in this country, particularly with reporting news. Because, in the old days of print, if something happened at 8 o'clock in the morning, we couldn't tell people until 5 o'clock the next afternoon. Today, you can tell them at 8:03.
Yeah.
But the problem that we have is, I have so few people, it's harder to get to the stories, but also it's all about incremental journalism. Because if it's happening, we want to tell them immediately. So the message that reporters are getting is, put up a couple of paragraphs, and then go back. And add a couple more paragraphs, and then go back. You may go back 5 times, but how many people have seen that 5th time to get the entire story?
Right.
And the concept is, well, you put it all together and you put it in print tomorrow.
Yeah.
But print circulation is going down.
Yeah.
So it's very worrisome to me that, I'm still a big print guy. The print newspaper is laying in front of you on your kitchen table. You see it. It stays there. It sustains itself. It's got sustainability. The internet, it's there and it's buried.
Well, there's also something about, Jane was experiencing the situation, thinking it through, processing it, and then writing it down and giving it to us.
But there was there's the idea that, knowing a whole story is important. Knowing a whole story, I have to say that, that I always said I didn't have, an education. I didn't have a lot of things, but I was an education. I was like a kind of an intelligence groupie. I wanted to know what the smart people thought, how they looked at it, and went for that as a standard, that somehow people that knew a lot were higher up on the ladder, and the effort was to find out a lot, to present a lot, to give a whole story, because that was important. There was a status involved, an emotional and intellectual, whatever, every kind of status was involved in knowing a lot about something. That, I think, is just doesn't, I don't find that anymore. So everything is a responsive thing to a blip, and that it's not an in-depth thing, that knowing a lot about something doesn't have the same cachet as it did when I think when I was a kid. It was, you really had to be able to stand up to questioning. Yeah. And the thing now is not about kind of, what do you know? It's kind of like, well, how do you feel? What did you respond to? And so the thing that everybody is equal because we're all entitled to our feelings, well, that's fine. But it's not the same as knowing a lot about something. Yeah. So I think like whatever it is, it's neutralized things in a bad way.
Well, what's happening today in journalism, particularly today, and this is not a political statement whatsoever, whether he was pro-Trump, anti-Trump, makes no difference to me. Right now, there's a war between the political world and journalism. And let's say Trump. A lot of the things he says is totally accurate when he talks about fake news, because what's going on at CNN and the New York Times is it's disgraceful in terms of the way the news is slanted. And believe me, I mean, I used to think the New York Times was the gold standard of everything. Mm-hmm. But CNN in particular, they are now making their reporters the subject of stories. Mm-hmm. So if you go on CNN and online and look at it, I don't know, say half the stories, maybe 25% of the stories, 30% of the stories, the reporter's name is in the headline. This is what this person thinks. Yeah. I don't care what you think. Yeah. It's the story. Yeah. And it's turning people off to legitimate journalism.
Yeah. And, you know, and it's very clear that in reading these articles, there was a whole different type of tone to the message that was happening, you know, and I think it allowed the reader to really have the whole story, to understand both sides of it. There were parents that wanted Willowbrook to stay in place because they felt it was just a matter of fixing it.
Well, it was
and
not
there were
just
parents that were totally against it, right?
But it wasn't just the tone. It was, you know, the fact is they had to stay with the article long enough to get the tone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they had to read the article, and there were things, when I read it, there were things in the middle of it, the fact that people didn't come back, and the shame of the fact that nobody visited, and the absurdity of the finger pointing, and the kind of dismissive everything you found out when you read the article.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that you know, it's pretty basic, but it's also the way it's played on the page. Mm-hmm. You know, people who might think the Jersey Shore is very important, well, maybe it's fun to read that. I don't know. But the population of Staten Island, they're doing a lot of other things. They're going to school, they're teaching, they're going to Manhattan, they're working on Wall Street. It's the newspaper's job, it's the newspaper editor's job to look around the community and say, well, what do we think is important here? Mm-hmm. And then as it's played, we're telling you, we think this is pretty important. Take a look. Yeah, yeah. Whereas on the internet, it's a massive things going on, and rivers flowing down, and what people who are supposed to try to give you some perspective as to what's important in our community, we're losing that ability.
Mm-hmm. So when in 1972, and it's interesting because now I didn't know that there was that linkage with Wilkins and Bronston. And I do know that they were the public health because they were activists. Right. I mean, that's
they were
clearly
activists.
what they were.
Right.
And so now they're involved in this. Consent judgment is starting to happen. It comes into the Advance. They put it in the it was a 1972 article saying that this lawsuit is being brought against Rockefeller. And Rivera comes in 72 with the key from Mike. Not this particular key, but one of these keys. Yes. I still have my key from Willowbrook. So then, did you have any contact? Did the Advance had contact with Rivera? What happened there? Right?
He sent somebody. I'll never forget it because he sent somebody, a staff member to the Staten Island Advance, and they came back and they went into the morgue, and Madeline Driscoll gave them all the copies of the articles that I had written. Yeah. Because that was the research. I mean, that kind of brought you up to speed. Yeah. That's what happened.
But there was no contact between you and him at all after he
No,
went
I think there was some distance.
Well, that's, when you asked before what was the mood in the newsroom, the mood in the newsroom was different when Jane was there because Rivera hadn't been involved yet. Mm-hmm. When I came and Jane was no longer with us, and Rivera sort of took over, the mood wasn't good. And it wasn't just because of Willowbrook, because the Advance always saw itself as sort of a distant stepchild, because we're in New York City. Well, I don't know how many newspapers there were in those days, but the New York
Well,
Post
there were
alone.
9 at one. There were 9 at one time.
The New York Post alone would publish twice in one day. They would get the stock closed at 4:00.
Yeah.
But you had the New York Times, the New York Daily News, the
World Telegram and
World
Sun,
Telegram, all these
Mirror.
newspapers. And then there was us over here just covering Staten Island. So we always felt like, like a little bit, pushed to the side. So now this guy comes along. And this was my thing. I mean, I used to rant about this. This woman was never mentioned in the scheme of the national politics.
Yeah.
Well, after 50 years, I've gotten over it.
He took care of that.
Not really, because he still
took care of that.
mentions it.
I will tell you that I have somewhere, there was a publication, I don't know if it still exists, called the Columbia Journalism Review.
Yeah, it still exists.
Okay, and they did a piece about the clash between print and TV news, and this Willowbrook story was the focus of the piece. That
Really?
that it was the print that
It actually initiated
that
the expose.
it was the print that lit it up, and then it was TV that exploded it.
Yeah.
So,
I have to give credit to Geraldo.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, as I say, it was, I guess maybe a little bit parochial in those days, but, and while I'm giving credit, let me give credit to Bill Fritz at the College of Staten Island.
oh yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to go.
Because-
I was going to go talk about the Willowbrook Mile for a bit.
Well, please do, because I'd love to talk about Bill and the college and my experience with the college over the years,
Yeah,
when some administrations didn't want to recognize Willowbrook.
absolutely. There's the Willowbrook Mile. I talked to you a little
Yeah.
bit about when we first met, and it's an interactive walking trail that winds through the IBR and the College of Staten Island and Elizabeth Conley Resource Center, which combined would make the original Willowbrook grounds. And there's stations along that path that tell about the story of not only the property when it was Halloran Hospital, the crossover gate, which talks about the college moving there, and then there's stations, the expose. And the expose talks about Jane Kurtin in Staten Island Advance and Geraldo Rivera.
Thank you.
And it's an important station, and it talks also about institutionalization, what that was and what it meant to people, and the dehumanizing effect on not only the people who lived there, but the people who worked there, who had to become desensitized to it, or else they wouldn't be able to go to work every day. We have a group of ex-employees that meet now. And I've been doing some videography with them of taping their thoughts and impressions over the years to hopefully put something together. And they'll be buying a bench along the mile in honor of those people that they worked with. But it talks about the deinstitutionalization process. It talks about the institutionalization process. It talks about the baby unit and how at that time there were no choices for parents. There were no other services, and they were told by their doctors at that time, this being the 50s, that this was a good place. And then I always go back, and whenever I have the chance to say it, the state wasn't trying to do a bad thing. They opened a state school, but then they didn't continue to support it. It became terribly overcrowded. It was for 4,000, 6,000 people were living there. The staffing numbers were abysmal. So it tells the whole story as you walk through. Then you stop at the archives, and all of your articles are in the archives. It stops by IBR to talk about the hepatitis studies that existed then, and how that can't exist anymore. So it has a duality of this is what was then, this is what is now. And the history there is that it not be repeated. That's the importance of the mile. And Bill Fritz, Tomas Morales was there before him, and we got some headway there with Michael Kress, who was putting in a walking trail. And then I met him, and we said, well, why can't we do both, right, and make it the Willowbrook Mile? And then when Bill Fritz came in, everything changed.
Yeah.
He came in with such passion to own the legacy of the property.
Yeah, Bill was the provost, I guess, with Tom Morales. And Tom really changed the atmosphere on the campus.
Well, he believed that it was a community
Yes.
college. So
just a little background. Well, before we get to that, I just wanted to tell Jane, the Advance, actually the bench campaign that Diane has referred to was my idea with Jay Chazanoff.
right, that was good.
So the Advance bought a bench in terms of free and local journalism. but we're also going to buy a bench in honor of you
Oh, my
for the
God.
Willowbrook Mile.
Yeah,
So there'll
there's
be-
only 2 benches at that station, and one of them is in your
Yeah, so-
name.
Because it's so important what you did for Staten Island and for the newspaper, frankly, in terms of, making us
Thanks. Oh,
keep
my
our
God.
roots. So we're very proud to do that.
It's pretty
But I think it was
amazing.
Hal and
It's
Laura
great, isn't
Kennedy
it?
we were just having a conversation one day many years ago. And they had said to me, they were looking to just get a stone on the campus with a plaque to remember Willowbrook. It's a no-brainer for me. I mean, this is easy. So I'm not going to name names, but I went to the president of the school, and I was told in no uncertain terms, on my campus, there will be never anything referencing Willowbrook State School. Oh. I was on the foundation board, the College of Staten Island Foundation board at the time, and we got into it, and I said a couple of things, but one of them was, this is not your campus. The campus belongs to the public. I subsequently was asked to leave the board, which I did. And then Tom Morales came, and the whole thing changed around.
Yeah.
And he invited me back on the board, and I'm still on the board. As a matter of fact, I was at a board meeting this morning. But Bill, they're not native Staten Islanders, but they really, really understand what
Both
to
he and Bonnie, his
recognize-
wife is a wonderful
Right.
supporter as well.
to recognize
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
And it's the old story, whether you're talking about the Holocaust or whatever you're talking about, you cannot forget the history, because it's going to happen again if we don't.
Well, we see it. Now, we already see
Yeah.
all of the markers already happening. We see some of the distancing of some of our politicians. We hear the term about the taxpayers, we can't tax any more money. And also, Russo mentioned about the duplication, they had cutting the fat, that
Cutting the
article.
fat. Oh, that was
Oh,
just
my God,
horrible.
so you hear some of these same things happening now. The repeated cuts that have happened over the last 7 years in our field is just devastating to agencies who are providing those services. And not only that, but they've made the entry into the system very, very difficult for families. And so to me, whether you isolate and segregate somebody at Willowbrook or you do the same thing to them in their own home, it's still the same end result. That person's life becomes dramatically affected in a negative way. So the Willowbrook Mile is important to keep that history alive. We're going to get there. Bill Fritz, as Brian said, has been just fantastic in it. We think the Willowbrook Mile will probably open next spring, at least in the first phase of it. And I was so happy when Brian said about you. I was like, this is
Gonna be able to
perfect,
put
Mr. Brian.
sit down on a bench that
That has your name on it, and a bronze plaque. We'll bring lunch and bring a bottle of wine. We'll crack open some wine and cheese.
I just want to know, want to say one thing. When you mentioned it at the beginning, talking about the never forget, and you just mentioned it again and made reference. I just wanted to tell you that my parents were Holocaust survivors, and I was actually born on the way here. But I was wondering when I was reading this again, and I was trying to remember, what makes you feel deeply about something. And I was thinking then that there was something about that, that there's something personal about feeling that what is happening to these people could actually be happening to you. So I had a very, very close relationship with that feeling. I mean, all the study about the children of survivors and everything, and all the, but that feeling that you can get in an article, that you can convey in an article, that you can humanize a situation when you have an opportunity to bring it, to go deeper into it, really does send the message, whether, maybe even subliminally, that this could, therefore, by the grace of God, whatever, this could somehow be your problem too. Mm-hmm. And you can identify with it and defend it if you have some personal connection to it. So the possibility of that, of that existing, can get a lot of support for a lot of different things. So you didn't have a child that was in Willowbrook or a neighbor, but you could somehow be someday the victim of a bureaucracy that didn't protect and defend you. That could light a fire.
It's amazing to me, really, how the community will react.
Yeah.
We started a program with an organization called Lifestyles for the Disabled.
Mm-hmm.
And they have something, you can describe it better than I can, but it's an agency that works with challenged.
Yeah, well, individuals with intellectual disability and challenges.
They have something called Lifewire News,
Right.
where they go out and they cover stories. So our advertising director's sister-in-law is a member of the programs. So he approached me, but to cut to the chase, we started a program where they are doing reporting for us.
I know, they reported my presentation at the Staten.
So
Yeah.
we approached, today journalism is, you have to get backing, advertising backing for a lot of this stuff. We approached Staten Island Honda, and Staten Island Honda sponsored the program. The response that Staten Island Honda is getting from people just coming in and saying thanks, it's extraordinary. And we are now getting letters requesting coverage and say, could you have Lifewire cover it?
That's cool.
So people do respond, but you gotta let them know about us.
Yeah.
Conversely, when we opened a very special place on Newdop Lane, this is now back in, a number of years ago, and I think the public hearing was in 78 or 79, and 200 people were there, and Genevieve and I, we had a police escort in and a police escort out. And we knew that it was going to be that way. It was very contentious at the time. And so my dad said to me, nervous, do you want me to go? I said, no, don't go, Dad. They're going to say terrible things about me. Don't go. You'll get yourself upset. He said, are you nervous? I said, I'm not really nervous. He said, well, how many people do you think live in this area? I said, I don't know, maybe, 20,000 people, Newdorp, Bay Terrace, because I lived in Newdorp. He said, right. He said, so when you get there and there's 200 people yelling at you, he said, just remember that there's 19,800 people who are not.
Yeah.
He said, because they think you're doing the right thing. He said, and just put one foot in front of the other. And it's true.
That's what I tell my reporters now in this world of internet journalism where people comment on stories anonymously, of course.
Mm-hmm.
It's a handful of people.
Right.
We have like 1 million readers or something, that's, over the course of a month.
That's right.
Yeah.
But people react so negatively to these negative comments.
Yeah.
And you really, that's a very good
That's
perspective.
a very,
Yeah,
very
and it was good. I mean, it just pushes you forward because you're going to get that. You put your head above the crowd, you're going to get hit with a tomato.
Yeah.
You live in New York, but the fact of the matter is that you still, if you're on the right path, there are people they're actually there. You just gotta visualize them in your head sometimes, right? An interesting fact that I'm not sure if you're aware of it or not. Is that the larger percentage of the doctors who worked there were Holocaust survivors.
I was not aware of that.
It's a very, very interesting perspective, because, they had difficulties locating doctors to work in state facilities. Yeah. And the doctors lived on the grounds. It was a very protected environment for them.
That's interesting.
And they were in charge. It's a very interesting study. I want to go speak to the woman from Wagner to talk to her about that whole perspective, because I was a young Brooklyn College kid, so I was very very attuned to Holocaust situation. I worked with somebody that was their thesis, and so we did some of the interviewing of families and such. So I was very sensitive to a kid on Staten Island. You didn't know anything about the Holocaust, truly, going out through high school and everything. But in college, I did learn more. And so when I saw the numbers on the doctors, I was in shock. And then I realized that 6 of the doctors that I knew were all Holocaust survivors that were there. So that's an interesting story. There were so many more stories and so little time. Very little time. I just looked up at the clock. Oh my goodness. It's been a wonderful, wonderful interview. I'm so glad that the audience was able to meet all of you, both of you, and your perspectives, your information. Thank you for all that you've done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the show again.
Thank you.